Hello, welcome to South Pole's live Q&A session on the recent SBTi Scope 3 update. My name is Rex Davenport. I'm a managing consultant with our climate advisory team here at South Pole. I'll be your host for the day. As you're likely aware, the Science Based Target Initiative recently released several publications regarding their Scope 3 update. First is the Scope 3 discussion paper outlining the SBTi's initial thoughts on potential changes to setting Scope 3 targets. Second is a synthesis report examining the effectiveness of environmental attribute certificates, or EACs, related to corporate climate targets. SBTi has released and plans to release additional reports as they progress. So with all of these updates, there are certain to be many questions from everyone working in the corporate climate space. So in the next 45 minutes, we'll work to address as many of those questions as we can. Before we jump in, just a few housekeeping notes we'd like to make. First, because we do have quite a few people joining us today, participants will be muted when you join. Your questions are welcome at any time, though, via the question box. We will prioritize the pre-submitted questions, so if we're not able to get to yours today, we will respond after the session. We'd like to thank those who submitted questions ahead of time for their submissions. To help us address as many as we can today, we've grouped similar ones together just in case you don't see your exact question here. Everyone attending will receive a recording of this session along with a document containing all of the questions and answers, so please keep an eye out for that post-session email. Joining me today, I have my colleagues from the Climate Advisory Team, Hamani Gupta, Principal Consultant, and Fiona Millett, Managing Consultant, as well as our Commercial Director for North America, Nav Korkilaroy. Hamani, Fiona, Nav, thank you so much for your time today. Hamani, I'd like to start off with you by asking you just how would you summarize the new guidance from SBTi?
Yeah, thank you, Rex. Very happy to be here today and looking forward to the discussion on a topic that has been on top of our minds over past few weeks. So let's jump right into it. The Scope 3 discussion paper. As you mentioned, it is part of the broader set of technical documents which were released by SBTi recently, with the specific goal of sharing its research and considerations for a more effective approach to Scope 3 target setting and implementation. And as we know, it's such a challenging topic. But before we discuss any further, I want to underline one key point here, that these papers and technical documents are meant to provide SBTi's preliminary thinking on this topic, as you said, and to encourage dialogue among different stakeholders rather than prescribing a definitive requirement or guidelines for target setting, which will come later in draft format this year and hopefully finalized next year, and it will be informed by this research. But this is just preliminary thinking research presented by SBTi. So, with that, let us try to take a step back and understand the context behind it. Um, as we all know, this past decade has seen an exponential increase in corporates taking voluntary climate action and considering science based target setting. And more importantly, I think companies are taking action not only on their scopes 1 and 2, but also incorporating their scope 3, to the point that SBT, based on the information released by SBTi, about 97% of the companies now include scope 3 emissions in their climate targets. And I think this clearly tells us that there is a growing realization among companies around the world regarding the importance of addressing their value chain emissions just beyond the direct emissions. And so, as we transition and companies transition from setting targets to actually implementing them, there's a deeper understanding of the complexities involved in decarbonizing corporate value chains. And so coming back to the scope 3 discussion paper, I think this is a response to this evolving landscape of understanding of scope 3, where sort of SBTi has taken a step to identify and acknowledge existing challenges and share its initial thinking on potential solutions to improve the effectiveness of the entire process of target setting for scope 3. So broadly, the paper is divided into two main sections, is how I read it. The first one focuses on the current limitations within how Scope 3 targets are set and measured. And I won't go deeper into that because we are all aware of all those challenges. It just reflects on the gaps between setting ambitious targets and the practical challenges of achieving them, particularly when it relates to the complexities of value chain emissions. But I think more importantly, the second section discusses several potential solutions and innovative approaches that SBTi is considering in order to address the current challenges. And we'll hopefully get to dive deeper into these approaches throughout this session today. But I can provide a brief overview to set a tone here. Um, so there are four buckets of potential solutions discussed in the paper, Scope 3 paper. The first one is around metrics. As we currently know, we use tons of greenhouse gas emissions as the metric for our Scope 3 targets, or for that matter, any science-based target, right? One suggestion that SBTi is considering is to supplement this metric with more outcome based metrics and alignment targets, which will hopefully provide a more nuanced understanding of companies' progress towards decarbonization. So that's one of the solution that SBTi is considering. Another one is considering alternatives to current blanket target boundary approach. SBTi is considering including more qualitative parameters like exposure to specific activities within Scope 3 in high climate impact sectors, or lock in emissions to prioritize action on climate relevant activities. The third one, I think, is incorporating a degree of influence over value chain partners. So, what that means is a company has varied level of influence over its value chain partners. So incorporating that when setting Scope 3 targets will hopefully result in a more realistic and impactful target. And then finally, the paper also discusses the role of environmental attribute certificates, so EACs, in value chain decarbonization, exploring how these instruments could be used to support a company's climate goals more effectively. Um, in addition, as you mentioned to the discussion paper, SBTi has also released a report synthesizing the evidence gathered during their call for evidence, I think last year, on the use of carbon credits and corporate climate targets. Again, all of this is part of a broader effort by SBTi to strengthen the tools and guidelines that companies have available to set and meet their climate commitments. Overall, I think the Scope 3 paper is a significant step forward in addressing the real world complexities of corporate decarbonization. It reflects SBTi's commitment to evolving their guidance in response to the challenges and opportunities that companies face all over the world when dealing with their value chain emissions.
Thank you for that very great summary of those reports. I do want to get into some more details of the technical aspects. So I'm curious, Fiona, would you be able to share with us what the actual new metrics SBTi is considering for both upstream and downstream emissions, so Scope 3?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rex. And it's great to be joining everyone today to discuss some of these updates as I know they're important. So I can build on what Himani started to introduce here. So the SBTi is actively exploring some additional metrics to better capture and drive progress on Scope 3 emissions. The exploration comes from a recognition that the current impact based metrics, which really focus on the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions, may not fully address the complexities and the challenges that companies face in managing their value chain emissions. So let's first take a moment to understand some of the challenges that there are with current metrics. Some of you may be very familiar with these. So the current metrics revolve around the aggregated Scope 3 GHG emissions, typically reported in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. So one of the first challenges is the variability in accounting methods. different scope 3 categories like purchase goods and services or business travel use varying methods for GHG accounting, which leads to inconsistencies and can make it really difficult to compare across different categories. Additionally, companies often have to rely on secondary data, such as emission factors from external databases or even using spend-based approach when it's appropriate. And as many know, it can be really challenging to obtain reliable primary data from suppliers to estimate value chain emissions. So it can be essential to kind of rely on some of those more secondary data sources. So these accounting methods are aligned with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the leading framework for corporate GHG accounting, but it does lack some nuance. So those aggregated scope 3 totals don't differentiate between the nature of different emission sources, such as emissions that come from the upstream production of a purchased good in the past versus those that might be involved with the downstream use of a product or its disposal in the future for products that might be sold during a reporting year. So in response to some of these well-known challenges, the SBTi is considering some ways to supplement these with more outcome-based metrics as opposed to just focusing on the GHG impacts. So outcome-based metrics would focus on the actions or the conditions that lead to lower emissions rather than just the quantified emission totals themselves. So this shift would aim to provide a clearer and more actionable framework for companies to align their activities with global climate goals. Some examples for what those new metrics might potentially look like. Starting with upstream examples. For purchase goods and services, you might have low carbon materials coverage being tracked. So a company might track the percentage of materials sourced from suppliers who have demonstrated low or zero carbon emissions in their production processes. Another example for upstream transportation and distribution, you might pursue zero or low carbon transportation alternatives. So that would measure the proportion of goods transported using this low or zero emission vehicles or logistics services rather than the traditional internal combustion engine. So then thinking about some downstream examples, that might look like responsible end of life options. So this could track the availability and the use of environmentally responsible disposal or recycling options for products at the end of their useful life. So that would probably relate to defining and eventually scaling a successful circularity program in some contexts. So in summary, these outcome-based metrics are still under consideration, and they're presented in the SBT's paper for feedback and further refinement. So definitely leave comments if you've got some thoughts on this. They do represent a potential shift towards a more dynamic and forward-looking approach to managing scope 3 emissions, rather than just focusing on that tons of CO2e that measures at face value that we've looked at traditionally. So overall, this does aim to make targets more actionable and aligned with the broader goal of achieving net zero emissions globally. So overall, SBTi is actively seeking input from stakeholders to ensure that these metrics are robust, practical, and effective in driving real-world decarbonization.
Great, thank you for that. I think this next question gets into what you pointed out, that these new outcome-based metrics are differentiated across the value chain. So would companies need to show what parts of their supply chains align with their SBTi targets, or are alignment targets something different?
Great. This question on alignment targets really gets to the core of how companies can effectively align their supply chains with this SBTi commitments. So alignment targets, as they're discussed in the SBTi's paper, are designed to help companies demonstrate how their policies and targets would align with global climate goals, specifically in the context of scope 3 emissions. So while this concept might sound new, it's really an extension of an approach that SBTi has already tested and been using in recent years. So you might have seen this in the form of supplier engagement targets or renewable energy procurement targets within the SBTi framework. So similar to the supplier engagement example, alignment targets for the upstream part of the supply chain might focus on activities such as the production or transformation of commodities. Here, an alignment target might involve increasing the proportion of commodities sourced from suppliers who are aligned with reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So this could mean choosing suppliers that have set science-based targets or who are actively working to reduce their carbon footprint. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to have a validated SBT, but they're taking steps to help decarbonize that specific commodity, such as green steel. So on the downstream side of supply chain emissions, alignment targets might aim to incentivize companies to shift their product or service offerings toward those that might be a bit more in line with net zero goals. So this could involve increasing the proportion of revenue derived from products or services that meet emission performance standards that are aligned with global climate goals. So, for example, a company could set targets to boost sales of a specific low carbon product or service relative to the rest of their products and services. So, practically, these alignment targets could have implications for how a company would both set and then track SBTs. Companies would need to embed these alignment targets into their broader corporate policies and strategies. So, this means they're not just setting targets at a high level, but ensuring that these targets are integrated and reflected in the day-to-day operations and decision making across the entire organization. It really would involve a true transformation of the company's operations and probably involve a wide range of potential stakeholders. Just as with the existing supplier engagement targets, alignment targets will require active collaboration as well with the customers and suppliers in your value chain. Companies would probably need to work closely with suppliers and ensure that they're progressing towards net zero goals and maybe providing support where necessary. They might also need to reshape their supply chain to prioritize suppliers that are more aligned with these goals. So, to show progress against these alignment targets, companies are going to need robust tracking and reporting mechanisms. This could involve monitoring the percentage of suppliers that have set SBTs or the proportion of revenue coming from low carbon products. This would supplement that traditional tons of CO2e equivalent emissions total that we've mentioned in the past, and it might provide a more holistic view, especially knowing those emission factors and various methods can fluctuate a lot and sometimes not tell the full story. So these metrics would help companies not only meet their SBTi commitments, but also make sure they provide transparency to stakeholders about how they're driving change within their value chain. So in summary, companies will need to show how parts of their supply chain align with their SBTs through these alignment targets, but they're intended to be a bit more specific and actionable. So this should really link a company's activities to its overarching goal of achieving net zero emissions, whether that's in the processes upstream related to sourcing, for example, or downstream in product sales. So by focusing on the alignment at the activity level, SBTi is essentially encouraging companies to make tangible, measurable progress towards these global climate goals.
Thanks, Fiona. Nav, we haven't had a chance to hear from you yet, and this next question I know is right in your wheelhouse. SBTi usually has quite a bit of technical jargon in it, and there are a lot of new terms introduced in these papers. So three key ones that have gotten a lot of attention: commodity certificates, environmental attribute certificates, and carbon credits. Can you shed some light? Are these all the same? Are they different? How do we specify these terms?
Thanks, Rex. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's so important to have the definitions down. So let me walk through each of these. Environmental attribute certificates, or EACs, are a diverse range of instruments that are used to quantify, verify, and track the environmental benefits that are associated with various commodities, activities, or projects. So they provide the proof that a certain amount of environmental benefit has been generated. And then this can be used for sustainability goals, or it can be traded. Now, I just want to note that the abbreviation EAC is also used for energy attribute certificates. So those of us on the call that work pretty closely on Scope 2 are likely familiar with this term. EACs, or RECs, renewable energy credits, as they're known in the US. This is just one type of environmental attribute certificate that SBTi is talking about. But broadly speaking, the environmental attribute certificates that are used for claims are fall under two broad categories. So carbon credits and then commodity certificates. A carbon credit represents the reduction, avoidance, or removal of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide, CO2, or its equivalent in other greenhouse gases. And the purpose here is they can be generated from activities both that are within a company's value chain or beyond. And that can be projects that are either avoiding emissions, so think in renewable energy projects, reducing emissions like energy efficiency measures, or removing carbon from the atmosphere like your reforestation projects. So for example, a company might purchase carbon credits just to say from a wind farm project to offset its emissions that it's producing from its manufacturing processes. Now, commodity credit certificates are a little bit different. These certificates provide verified information about the sustainability attributes of the specific commodity. So think agricultural products, energy, or industrial materials. So commodity certificates are used to communicate the environmental or social performance of a commodity, basically ensuring that they're meeting the sustainability standards. They don't necessarily represent a direct reduction or removal of emissions like a carbon credit, but rather they confirm that the commodity was produced in a way that aligns with sustainability goals. So example here is back to the renewable energy credits. They represent the environmental benefit of generating electricity from renewable sources. So kind of in summary, are they the same? No, they're not quite the same, but they are all instruments that kind of fall under the broad category of environmental attribute certificates, and they serve different purposes. Carbon credits convey mitigation outcomes of an activity, while commodity certificates provide kind of climate-related performance information. Both categories of certificates, though, they enable companies to substantiate environmental claims. They can support compliance with both voluntary or regulatory schemes, and ultimately enhance transparency when you're within the value chain.
Got it. And specifically, I know a question we've gotten a lot from clients and others we've worked with. What does SBTi specifically say about use of carbon credits for their Scope 3 targets? What do they recommend or recommend avoiding?
Thank you. I think another great question I know a lot of folks have had on their mind. So there are 5 potential scenarios that SBTi lays out, and this is split between commodity certificates and carbon credits. I'll walk us through each of the scenarios, but as we're talking about these, just keep in mind that these scenarios are still under review. There hasn't been any definitive guidance, but these are potential pathways and promising use cases. So first 2 scenarios, commodity certificates from value chain activities, and then commodity certificates from sources that have little or no value chain traceability. So SBTi here kind of acknowledges that commodity certificates that are within value chain activities are an important approach for supporting a company's kind of value chain mitigation claims, provided again that they have strong traceability or are produced in a way that's consistent with reaching net zero emissions. Under the second scenario, where there's like little or to no value chain traceability, what SBTi does here is it proposes some guardrails. And that's really to ensure that there's quality of the certificate. So proposed guardrails here looks like the potential limitation on volumes or maximum periods of interim use. The last 3 set of scenarios here is related to the carbon credits. So carbon credits for mitigation activities within the value chain, carbon credits that are used to support the neutralization of residual emissions, and then finally carbon credits purchases that are used to support beyond value chain mitigation. Scenario 3 here kind of considers the use of carbon credits from activities that are within the value chain. And ultimately here, there's no firm words on whether on SBTi on this. They're still continuing their research to reach a conclusive decisions, and they're looking at factors such as double counting and the standardization of value chain traceability. Scenario 4 is looking at the neutralization of residual emissions using carbon removal credits, and that's up to a volume of 10% of baseline emissions. So that's including Scope 3, and to meet net zero requirements. So SBTi here kind of suggests that they'll perform further research, specify some guidelines in areas such as matching emissions type with the types of removal credits that are used, and to this extent, the SBTi actually does encourage and in fact requires that companies compensate for the residual emissions, including those in Scope 3 at net zero target years. And then finally, scenario 5, this is here SBTi is encouraging the use of carbon credits to contribute to beyond value chain mitigation, and that's to account for residual emissions along the decarbonization pathway. So SBTi also suggests some guardrails here, and that's just to mitigate potential risks that can includes considering supply side quality criteria, so when you're sourcing credits, as well as considering kind of the robust claim systems. And that's to ensure transparency, especially when you're making some corporate related climate claims. So kind of in short, the SBTi paper isn't necessarily suggesting that carbon credits can be used for Scope 3 abatement. Instead, what they're saying is, credits should be used in the near term to contribute to mitigation activities, and then in net zero years across all scopes to neutralize emissions. And then, we really hope to see some further guidance released on that first 3 scenarios soon, in the hopes that it'll clarify the use of commodity certificates and credits just as a part of corporate climate strategies.
Yeah, definitely. And Hamani, I'm wondering if you can jump in on this too. Nav mentioned, a few different scenarios and some still waiting to hear from SBTi on some of these. So right now, what carbon credits can companies use looking at their SBTi net zero target, especially those residual emissions, that 10% that Nav mentioned? Alternatively, what can they use for beyond value chain mitigation? And why should companies still use carbon credits as part of their SBTi strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Rex. I mean, great question, and something which we get a lot as companies try to understand all the different components of SBTI's net zero target and beyond, right? And I think Nav gave a great summary of different types of credits. So just building off of that, I think let's try to first understand what different types of carbon credits there are, because this question focuses specifically on carbon credits. So the most important distinction is the difference between avoidance and removal carbon credits. So let's break that down a little bit. Avoidance credits, as their name suggests, are the certificates that represent 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions, which would have ended up into the atmosphere without a specific activity or project generating those credits. So we are avoiding the um, emissions from getting into the atmosphere here. And as an example, we can think of projects like wind farms or avoided deforestation, which would avoid emissions from getting. Removal credits, on the other hand, are those which represent an action which actively removes and stores greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So what this is doing is the emissions which have already been emitted into the atmosphere, they're removing and storing them back. So here we can think of activities like geological sequestration, afforestation, or even more technical projects like direct air capture, as an example of removal credits projects. So now the question is, which of these credits can be used for beyond value chain mitigation and for net zero targets? So let's talk about beyond value chain mitigation. And this, as a reminder, is I think scenario 5 from what Nab was mentioning. So beyond value chain mitigation is where companies are encouraged to take action to cover their residual emissions on the path to net zero as they transition to net zero. And here there is no distinction between the type of carbon credits that can be used. So a company can use either the avoidance credits or the removal credits. However, we always recommend companies who are engaging in beyond value chain mitigation to look at a broader range of projects across both avoidance and removals, and also ensuring the quality of projects and credits sourced from them. If we talk about the SBTi's corporate net zero standard, here SBTi's guidance requires that at your net zero target year, so when you are hopefully close to achieving net zero target, you should be using only removal credits to neutralize your residual emissions, as you mentioned, the 10% residual emissions. You cannot utilize, at least based on the current guidance, um, the removal, or sorry, the avoidance credits here. Again, here the focus should be on the quality of the projects and the credits to ensure that there is a flow of finance to maximize the impact and the effect. Ultimately, as companies plan for their net zero target years, they will need to source and guarantee volumes of carbon credits within their budgets to ensure that they are able to meet their net zero requirements. And this means that they should be building a comprehensive and dynamic carbon project portfolio, which can be actively managed and adjusted to suit the best practices in the corporate value chain as they evolve and as the new guidance comes from SBTi.
Thank you for that guidance and clarity. We talked about beyond value chain mitigation. The other side of this is within the value chain or insetting. And so the new guidance does include insetting, but the guidance is still unclear on how to draw specific geographic boundaries for insetting. So can you shed any light on how corporates or companies can confidently inset and account for interventions within their value chain based on the current guidance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, insetting is an extremely relevant concept right now, given that it allows companies to address their scope 3 emissions by investing in projects within their own value chain, as you said, right? So, I think the understanding right now is more advanced for companies which have agricultural value chain, but it is definitely evolving for other sectors as well. As you pointed out, there is still some uncertainty in the guidance, and particularly around defining geographical set boundaries for insetting activities. So one of the most important source of information on insetting right now is the greenhouse gas protocol land sector and removal guidance, which states that. So just let me clarify that it right now focuses only on companies with agricultural value chains, but I think there's a lot to be derived from that for other sectors as well. So this guidance states that insetting should ideally take place at the farm level where there is direct traceability to the land management unit. And if that is not possible, then at the sourcing region level with of course safeguards and rail guards around it. This means that for insetting to be credible, the interventions need to be clearly linked to the specific areas within your supply chain that you are directly influencing or tracking. So getting to the second part of the question on how companies can confidently inset within the bounds of the current guidance, I think there are a few key principles to keep in mind. The first one is ensuring that there is direct traceability, as I mentioned before. If direct traceability again is not there, then sourcing region concept can be applied. And I think I need a separate session to talk about that. But in short, it is where you have a direct traceability within the sourcing region from which you are sourcing from. There are additional safeguards, as I mentioned previously, in the land sector guidance that should be applied. And this traceability is crucial for verifying that the environmental benefits from an insetting project are genuinely tied to a company's value chain. The next principle, I think, is that companies should define their sourcing regions based on the land sector and removals guidance to ensure that their insetting efforts are targeted and effective. And what this means is that they should clearly map out the first point of collection or processing facilities and understand the areas that they're covering and they're sourcing from. What else? So, insetting also requires close collaboration with suppliers and landowners to implement sustainable practices. Again, that can be traced back to the company's sourcing region. I think traceability, is, as you can probably see, is the recurring theme here and it's most important. And by working together, companies can ensure that the benefits of insetting are directly linked to their own supply chains. And finally, transparent documentation of all of this is super critical. This includes detailed records of the interventions, geographic boundaries that they cover, and the expected or achieved environmental outcomes from any insetting activity. So, sorry for the long response here, but if I were to summarize my thoughts on insetting and what an credible insetting would look like, I would say that while the guidance on insetting is still evolving, companies can confidently move forward by focusing on traceability at the farm or the sourcing region level, as defined by the land sector and removals guidance. And by carefully defining these boundaries and ensuring that insetting activities are directly linked to their supply chains, companies can definitely make credible and impactful contributions to their scope 3 reductions.
Well, I certainly agree. I think we'll need an entire webinar just for this one topic to go in depth. So perhaps look out for that in the future. I do want to shift now, though, to a slightly different topic. Fiona, I know for the last year or so, you've been plugged into following emerging regulations, both in the US and internationally. So this is an important question for many companies. What is that relationship between SBTi and the potential regulations that they might be subjected to? So this might include SEC, this might include state level regulations. So what is the alignment, or how do these differ?
Yeah, there's a lot of movement on this side of things globally. So we've been tracking closely at South Pole. As we've noted, the SBTi is the leading voluntary target setting framework for defining climate goals in line with climate science. And there are a lot of regional and global regulations that have been proposed and adopted that interact with these science based targets. Importantly, they also will impact the implementation and disclosure of these targets in particular. So, as many are aware, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, released a climate disclosure rule which impacts what information needs to appear in financial disclosures. We hosted a webinar on this earlier in the year, and we're happy to circulate if helpful to folks. But while the SEC is primarily focused on disclosure of GHG emissions and climate related risks, as well as the governance of these details, there is also a specific requirement to disclose climate goals and targets. So that inherently links this SEC rule with a company's SBT. The SEC rule, though its implementation is temporarily paused, would require SEC registrants to cover climate related targets or goals that are material to their business, results of operations, or financial conditions within their financial filings. So, what this means in practice is that if you're setting an SBT or other climate related targets and goals, those will need to be included in SEC filings. In terms of other regulatory movements, there are several states, such as California, that have introduced or plan to introduce legislation to require disclosure of emissions, as well as risks, credits, and claims. While this is an ongoing discussion, the consensus is that it's important for companies to be prepared to disclose and report on those emissions and decarbonization strategies, prioritizing transparency and accountability throughout that process.
Great. And similarly, another item is, with last year we got the new flag guidance. Is there anything about flag in these new papers from SBTi we should be aware of?
So flag emissions, or those relating to forest, land, and agriculture, as Himani was touching on a little bit, are quite important, especially within certain industries. But the current Scope 3 discussion paper that was just released doesn't talk specifically around flag related targets. So the focus of the paper is more so on addressing the broader complexities and challenges associated with Scope 3 target setting. So not a ton of notable takeaways there relating to flag targets, but the prior guidance should still be relevant for the time being.
Great, thank you for that. So I do want to keep things moving, knowing that we are coming towards the end of our session. So Nav, I would like to go to you as well, and just think about, if we take a step back for the broader carbon market, how might the SBTi's views on these credits impact the regulatory environment or the voluntary carbon market?
Thanks, Rex. And it's so important to consider, especially everything that Fiona just mentioned. And I think this is a question that's helpful to break down a bit. So to start, SBTi has provided 5 scenarios in their discussion paper where credits and commodity certificates play a role. So that's really useful. Equally, I think it's key to highlight that this, again, is a discussion paper. It's not guidance, and even SBTi themselves kind of state that it shouldn't be taken in this way. So some people in the market, may take this as an indication of guidance until there's further clarity in 2025. But it's really important to note that the carbon market overall is still growing significantly and has done in the past 4 years. And that's despite, the absence of any significant near-term guidance from the SBTi to date. So you'll see that committed market participants, in fact, are leveraging these markets to go above and beyond. And to that extent, I think we think, it's really unlikely that that'll cause a significant retreat. But the lack of clarity, the uncertainty, I think, will cause some new entrants to be maybe dissuaded from joining into the market in the near term. Finally, I think there's a few kind of important areas for the market that's under the SBTi's kind of 5 scenarios that's important to note. First, under scenario 4, SBTi has kind of reiterated their net zero standard that requires companies to neutralize their residual emissions at target years with removals. So even with this step, there remains a huge potential demand for the use of carbon removals in just the next couple of decades. And shrewd companies will realize and recognize the need to engage in the market well in advance of their target years to really ensure that you can guarantee supply. And then in support of the near term, they can also continue to support their own beyond value chain mitigation, that BVCM approach that's under scenario 5, which effectively kind of encourages companies to use carbon credits to offset their emissions while decarbonizing their value chain. And that's kind of common market practice right now. I think another thing just to quickly note is that there are integrity initiatives out there as well. And so while the effectiveness of carbon credits, has been questioned recently, the SBTi themselves kind of highlight the limitations in the evidence of their report. There are also just several integrity initiatives that are out there right now looking at carbon credit quality and then best practices in the use of claims that are made around credit. So all of this are efforts that are working to kind of provide confidence to buyers in the market and in the effective use and deployment of carbon credits. And then maybe just the final point to your question about governments, government action on carbon markets. I mean, we're seeing an increased engagement from the public sector as governments, both those with ambitions as carbon exporters and then those with ambitions as carbon importers, are kind of seeking to define what are their strategies going to be as they work to meet their national climate targets. So while SBTi remains an important framework in all of this, governments will be watching the project-based compliance markets and Article 6, the UN carbon-led project initiative, just as fundamental drivers to their strategies as all these initiatives are refined and improved over time.
Great, thank you. I know we are coming to the end here, so I want to try to think about, how we sum this all up for everybody. So Fiona, based on everything we've discussed, based on these papers, what is your takeaway? Is it going to be more difficult for companies to set and meet their SBTIs now, or SBTi targets?
Well, this is a good question because it impacts our day-to-day, how we're actually setting and implementing targets. And at the end of the day, most of us are interested in understanding how these really lengthy, robust documents might impact us and our stakeholders in pursuit of these Scope 3 targets. So we will know more when the SBTi releases its draft of the corporate net zero standard update for public consultation towards the end of Q4 this year. Until then, the discussion paper does indicate that the SBTi fully appreciates the challenges that companies are facing in setting and implementing Scope 3 targets. The SBTi is taking a holistic approach and considering several innovative approaches that we started to discuss today to address some of these existing limitations in the target setting process. In short, our point of view is we expect some of these changes might translate into a bit more work up front on the target setting side of the process, but it may actually help make it a bit more straightforward to implement the targets and demonstrate progress. So for the target setting side of things, some aspects that could be a little bit trickier are several additional factors when selecting target boundaries, prioritizing which climate relevant emission sources need to be prioritized in the near term, and then developing a robust framework of targets and supporting policies to address value chain emissions. But as I mentioned, we do expect this to streamline and hopefully make the target implementation process itself clearer for companies, which is great. These changes will hopefully help in reconciling the realities of all of the complex value chains that we see today. So really exciting to see that this can help companies overcome some of the real and perceived barriers that might hinder decarbonization. Our hope is that these will allow companies to truly deliver on their climate goals across their entire value chain.
Great, thank you for that. And yeah, I look forward to seeing this play out in our work with our clients and across the climate space. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time, so we will have to stop here. I'm sure there's a lot more we could have gotten into. So thank you again, Nav, Hamani, Fiona, for your insights on these important and emerging questions. I'd like to thank all of our South Pole clients who are on the call today for joining us. For anyone not familiar with South Pole, we are a carbon asset developer, and we are a global full-service climate consultancy working on climate action since 2006. We partner with clients throughout the climate journey, from measuring emissions, setting targets, reduction strategies, and then communicating those actions. So again, everybody who joined us today, thanks again for your time. You will receive a recording of today's session, and we will get back to you if you send any through any questions that we didn't get to today. So thank you again for joining us. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have further questions on SBTs or your organization's own climate journey. Until we talk again, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.